Welcome to Stuart Rothgiesser. Stuart is the founding director of ROTH, which is a consulting and professional service company that helps clients in the private, social, and public sectors understand, inspire, and grow their people. And he's recognized in the fields of narrative intelligence, communications and research. And in the last 20 years, he's worked for Fortune 500 companies and some of the world's largest NGOs, as well as some universities. And he's calling in today from Johannesburg in South Africa. And his session today is entitled Using Personal Story for Stakeholder Engagement. And a sub-question of how does one combine personal story and social science for research purposes? So welcome, Stuart.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's great to be with you. And maybe you could tell us just a little bit about how you got interested in organizational storytelling.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I got interested in organizational storytelling through quite a strange twist of turn. In 2008, I was attending Africa Burn, which is South Africa's equivalent of the Burn, which is held out in Nevada. And I decided that I was going to collect personal stories. That was going to be my gift. At Africa Burn, one has to do something, one has to give some kind of artistic or creative endeavor.
And Stuart, just stop for a second and
Sure.
Tell us a little bit more of what the Burn Gathering is.
So the Burn Gathering is held out in the desert, and it's a gathering of people who want to do something creative. They usually go for about 5 days, very harsh conditions. And so people will build entire sculptures, they'll create floats, they'll do artistic endeavors, and there's also an idea of sharing. There is no money spent at the Burn, and one has to bring everything and be self-reliant. And so the idea is to participate, and my idea of participation was to collect personal stories. That was my artistic gift. And people said to me, that's not really doing anything. That's not building something, that's not art. But I stuck with it, and I found a couple of comrades in arms, and we bought a digital recorder, and we made a sign that said, share your story. And we bought these big Arabic outfits and hats, and we went out. And one of the comrades in arms dropped out very quickly. He got lost in all the chaos and confusion. But the other two went around, and we really learned a lot about collecting personal stories from this exercise. We went around different camps, and we offered to listen to people's stories. And the response was overwhelming. People really wanted to speak. They wanted to tell their stories. They wanted to be heard. Amongst all the chaos of the music, you must imagine at this camp, there's color, thousands of people. There's moving trucks, people have built all kinds of sculptures. And amongst all of that, we managed to create space, actually, where people could sit down and tell this life stories. And we had stories of conversion, we had stories of love, we had Khoisan mythology.
Talk right now, I'm in that session.
And we became
sorry.
Sure. Maybe people want to mute if they're not.
Good. I think, sorry, I think I have everybody muted now.
Okay. So in this time, we became news bearers. We'd carry stories from around the camp. And we also learned that in order to collect stories, one has to share stories. So often we would go up to people and we say, well, share your story with us. And they'd say, well, share your story. We don't know who you are. We want to know who you are. And so we changed the sign from share your story to share a story. And then from that, we decided that we wanted to, once we returned, at the time I was living in Cape Town, we wanted to combine new media, technology, and the ancient art of storytelling, and build a website with social media capacity that people could upload their stories, either through text, through writing, or through using the camera as we're doing now. They could speak their stories, and we would categorize them along different lines. We were particularly interested in the power of stories to share cultural learning. We were interested in stories to share cultural learning and how we could pass down certain oral traditions through story. And so after a process, we managed to build a website that had all the social media things of sharing and liking, etc. And that was my introduction to story collecting. I also did a few courses with the International School for Storytelling from Sussex. They come out of South Africa twice a year. And so I learned from these courses on the difference between storytelling or performance and what we were more interested in, which is story collecting. And that's about actually extracting or harvesting personal stories from people and the uses for that. So that's how I got into it 10 years ago. And
can I stop you for a second,
sure.
Stuart?
Sure.
One question I was interested in. So the folks, when you were at the Bern conference and you said, tell us a story or tell us your story. And then they said, well, tell us your story.
Yeah.
Did you share a story with them to in any synopsis of that or anything you might share of that?
I can't remember what stories we shared. I really can't for the life of me, honestly, remember what stories we shared. But it was very much, we came away with a strong feeling that in order to collect the stories, we had to be vulnerable and we had to share some of our stories. But we collected stories about love, about conversion. We collected stories from parents about about family. So there were quite a few different environments we were in. And we were in camps where people were quite drunk, or we were in camps where people were more individual. The challenge was actually going into these spaces, explaining what we were doing, and then being able to draw someone away from the rest of the crowd into a quieter space where we could create that space where they would share their story. So that was kind of a trial by fire, but it lent some very good lessons for us.
So let's just go with that for a second more, because sometimes people want to get someone to share a story when they're in the hubbub of a company or any organization or at a conference. Was there anything that you found that helped to make that an authentic experience in the somewhat private atmosphere? As you think back all those years ago, what helped create that container so that the story sharing could happen?
I must say, and I think that this has remained with us throughout different projects and contracts that we've done in story collecting, and it sounds a little bit otherworldly, but I think it's actually the energy that we brought to the project. In this case, it was Warren Turner and myself, the co-founders of Share a Story, but subsequently it's been the teams at ROTH. And it really is this energy which is around, it's an energy of enthusiasm, it's an energy of curiosity, it's an energy of wanting to understand who is this person in front of me. And there's an authenticity behind that energy that really allows for the good responses we have. So we've been on, we've had a few contracts where we've been on the road, literally. One of the work we did was for the local, the Western Cape government tourism destination marketing organization, and we were going up the west coast of South Africa. The organization wanted to push more visitors up the west coast, away from the big centers like Cape Town or along the Garden Route, and they'd contracted us to collect personal stories from this area. We then built a website, and I can share the URL with you. And as you travel up the road, there are different towns. And as you click on the town, out will emerge information about the town, as well as our podcasts. that we've collected and photographs. But the problem or the challenge was that this area is known for its storytellers. And so when we started working with them and we said, send us a list of your storytellers, they sent literally a list of 300. And we said, we can't work with this. So what we did instead was we coached the local tourism officials to host storytelling evenings. And we explained to them how to run the evenings. And we had a series of 5 or 6 towns. And at each town, they would have an evening where they invited the community and they had picked a few storytellers. And we went and we listened. And then afterwards, we went up to them and said, could we come sit with you tomorrow in your house and or in your workplace? And invariably, people said yes. And and I think it's the energy that we come with. People shared very intensely personal stories with us. And they trusted us to take these stories back into the big cities and onto the web. And one of the biggest disappointments, Tom, or challenges, is that particular contract, the stories took about 2 years before they found the light of day. And it's very difficult for us to go back to these individuals, some of whom are farmers, painters, and we promised them that the story was going to be shared far and wide, and the client sat on them for a very long time. So that was one of the ethical challenges. And when we teach story collecting courses now, we always go back to around the importance of explaining to storytellers where their stories are going to go, and sometimes the fact that they may not see the light of day even. But I think, to go back to it, I think it's really the energy, the honesty behind the story collectors that allows people to open up. I believe that people want to share their story, and many people in this world don't have the opportunity to be listened to. We pay thousands of dollars to go to therapists to listen to us. And I think, ironically, in the age of social media, there's less and less chance for people to really be focused and listen to. And I think that's a great service that we're doing as story collectors.
Great. Let's take a minute. You've talked a little bit about story collection and being a story collector. And I think, Stuart, that there's a lot of people in our group who are similar, that they don't really see themselves as much as a storyteller, as one who's intensely interested in story, likes to collect stories, likes to listen to stories, likes to analyze stories, likes to plot trends through the stories that they're hearing. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to be a story collector versus a storyteller? And they're certainly not mutually exclusive, because I know a lot of people who love to tell stories are the very best listeners, and they like to collect them so they can share them. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive at all. But we, as a company, we face this challenge of having to compete with hundreds of so-called storytellers. So everyone these days call themselves storytellers. And I actually wrote an article about the difference between storytelling and story collecting, because this term has become very overused. So you'll have people that are documentary makers who produce news programs that are very hard-hitting news programs, and they go on their own and call themselves storytellers. And those are the worst kind of people to call themselves storytellers, right? Because journalists are people that want to find a certain angle and then tell that, as opposed to, I think, what we like to do, which is allow the story to unfold. Often we'll have an idea of a story and we'll workshop the stories with our clients. But once we get on the road, the actual story that emerges is something quite different. And that has implications for sign-off, because you've told the client, we're going to collect a story about Tom, and here's a guy who's coming of age story. But once we sit down with Tom, we find out there's something else that's much more interesting. And then you actually need to.
And one of the things about Tom is that he's a former newspaper reporter and editor, and got his start in story through some of the journalism. And we did, news people always refer to their pieces as this story I'm working on.
Right. Right, and that's the challenge that we face, because our process is not one of, as journalists, and I also worked as a journalist for a while. You kind of have an end goal and you try and work backwards. And our process is an opening up process. So we will start with some idea, but if we listen carefully, and when I teach story collecting, it's about listening for the silences and listening for what's not said. Then you'll find that there are far deeper layers that the person will reveal. So the process of story collecting is one which requires building rapport, building trust, often very quickly out in the field. There's certain issues as a white male. It may be more difficult for me to build trust with certain people, but that actually hasn't been the case. Again, I think if you're willing to spend the time, and by time I mean minimum of 2.5 hours, 3 hours to collect one story. We spent 2 days, 3 days with one person, because again, the story will unfold. And sometimes what will happen is we'll have one person and they'll have 2 or 3 stories. So we were collecting an employee engagement story of a woman who worked for a big fishing company. And the main story was around how through a company payout, she was able to purchase a better house, improve her standard of living, send her children to school. But there were sub-stories through this. There were sub-stories of being a woman and she wanted to become a police officer, but as a woman it was very difficult. How as a woman she's encouraging her daughters to go further in life, how she earns more money than her husband. She is getting a driver's license. There were other layers of how she would be the first person to buy a car in the family. And so there were all these sub-layers, and we were able to actually cut 3 videos out of one. But it was because we'd spent so much time with her and were able to follow these different threads. So it's really about being able to be open and to follow the threads that are interesting, the pearls. I call them the pearls that are dropped in the conversations.
So one of the things I'm hearing, and just check to see if I have this right, is as a story collector, you don't start with a direct end game. Like if a newspaper reporter is reporting about a fire, they're going to have the fire definitely tied into it. But maybe the net is a little bit wider because you're trying to look at that open-endedly. So when you're looking for engagement, it could mean whatever it means to that individual.
Yeah, the net is much wider. And it's one of the challenges we have working with clients because they're not used to this. So we mostly work with heads of communications, heads of marketing, and they're used to an agency coming in saying, we're going to produce this story for you. We're going to shoot so many days on these locations using this crew, and we may even have an actor or a model. And our process is very different. Our process is, what is the message you're trying to convey to your stakeholders? Okay. What are the possible stories in your organization that could tell these messages? And then who are the people? So we spend a lot of time up front. Then we'll go to the people, we'll listen to them. Do they have a story? Is it the same story that the marketing team think it is, which it often isn't? Are they willing to tell the story? Can they speak well enough? What are the demographics of the different audience? We can't have all females or all certain ages telling us stories. And once we've done all of that sort of consulting or research, then we'll go out into the field and collect the story. And even once we're in the field, there'll be these iterations of a story that we'll collect. As a business, we have to be mindful of what our target is, but the stories will often almost invariably won't be exactly the same as we had in mind.
Yeah. And let's jump to the question, and then we'll pause after the answer to this to just if anybody has any questions who's listening. But tell us a little bit about where that overlap or how you use personal story for social science work.
So part of my background besides communications is in social science. I have a master's in anthropology. And one day after Africa Burn, the light came on that I could combine story collecting, social science, and communications. So we use one of the sort of channels of work we do besides communications is research. And we particularly look at stakeholder engagement. And we use stories in focus groups, particularly. We are looking for stories of practice within organizations. And these are kind of the water cooler conversations. But we've also found that we can embed fictional story and extract very deep findings from the use of that. And that came about just through chance, through one of our employee focus groups a few years ago.
Take us just briefly through what you mean by that, of how does fictional story help with that, and what is the social science aspect of it, the collection and documentation, kind of empirical research, or what do you mean by that?
So we're talking about qualitative research, and I think the best example is one that we used a few years ago for a trucking company. The company was concerned that their employees were going to jump ship because competitors were bringing out new lines sooner than they were. And so we ran 3 focus groups, and we started the groups. Well, we have a certain container building warm-up where we use nickname storytelling, which is very effective. So, tell us the story of your nickname, and people share that, and first in pairs, then they report back. So it's a listening example as well. If they don't have a nickname, then we can ask them to tell the story of your name. It's an icebreaker and a very effective one. And then we told them a story of the two brothers. And the story goes like this. There were 2 brothers who both lived in the same town. The older brother was working as a baker, and the younger brother was living by the dam, and he decided to learn the language of the frogs. And a few years passed, and the older brother by now was being quite successful, and he was opening a second bakery. And he came back to his younger brother and he said, "Come join me. I need your help. I need someone I can trust. Help me in the business. I'll give you shares and you'll be successful." The younger brother at this stage has got really long hair. He's quite emaciated. He says, No, I'm learning the language of the frogs, and I'm making real progress." The older brother shakes his head and says, "You're crazy. I don't have time for this." And he storms off. A few months pass, and by now the older brother is really successful and he's about to get married. He comes back to his younger brother and he says, "I'm getting married. I really need your help. Come, I'll set you up with a house. I'll give you, the best part of the business." And the younger brother at this stage is he's malnourished. He's got sores all over his face. And he says, No, I'm almost there. I can feel I've almost learned the language of the frogs. So again, the older brother storms off. About 3 weeks later, there is a plague of frogs in the town. The entire town is just inundated with frogs. And the mayor asks the older brother to go and get some help from his younger brother. So the older brother comes and says, "Look, we've got a plague of frogs. Won't you come and help us?" And the younger brother gets up and he goes to the town and he manages to clear the town of this plague. Everyone's very, very happy, and the mayor says to him, "Here's the key to the town. You can have your choice of any plot of land. We'll find you a beautiful woman to marry." And the younger brother says, "No, I'm going back to where I belong." So we told this story and we let it sit. And the salespeople we're talking about here are 45 to 50-year-old men, all men, quite conservative. They've been doing this for a while. And we just let this story sit, and we continued asking them the usual questions you ask in a focus group, like in this case, what are your rewards that you're looking for? What are some of your issues? And later, what happened was some of these ideas started bubbling up, ideas of loyalty, of what's really important to them, of what they would give up in return for staying where they were. They told us that they weren't going anywhere. They said you can't sell ponds for 10 years and sell inoxa the next day. They'd staked their caps on selling this brand of trucks. And even though they had issues around the technology and the rewards, they weren't going anywhere. So just like the younger brother, there was something deeper for them, something in their identity about what they were doing. They saw themselves as rugged individuals who were on the road making their own business. They wanted certain benefits like gas allowance, cell phone allowance, etc. This report is still being used years later by the clients because of the depth and the texture of the data that we received. And so we learned almost by chance that we know that stories speak to some of our deepest needs and our fears and hopes. But by using fictional story, it's quite counterintuitive actually. By embedding a story like that, you can actually start to tap into your audience's psyches and archetypes.
Yes, and just our last session was on generative storytelling, and I was talking about fictional stories and how they can help unlock all kinds of other things that are going on in our lives. And
Absolutely.
interesting enough, the Healing Storytelling Alliance, in one of their last conversations, it was a very similar topic with this woman, Beth Olson, who's written a book on the 12-step program, and she's put a fictional story in each one of the steps. And it helps unlock the concepts of the steps for people to share their own stories. But let's take a minute here and see if anybody has a question. So if you do, I see that a team does. So it's a team, you've unmuted yourself, so go ahead.
I think you're on mute.
How's that?
Now, yes, gotcha.
Okay. I said, thank you. This is very rich. And I noticed that you mentioned narrative intelligence. And perhaps the example you gave us is one of those examples, but I wonder if you would expound on the notion of narrative intelligence, please.
Sure. So narrative intelligence was coined by Steve Denning as early as 2007. And for us, narrative intelligence refers to how well or how poorly leaders engage with story. And what that means is more than just leaders using stories to convey organizational or personal values. So we do leadership story coaching, where we help leaders to share personal stories that are in line with the organization's strategy. But it's also how well organizations and leaders are able to use the skills of story, such as being able to extract insights from their stakeholders, how well they can listen, how they use narrative techniques in their communications. And so that's really the pinnacle of the work we try and do. We're finding at the moment that in difficult economic situations, most corporates are not really prepared to pay for what's still regarded as the soft stuff. So they're willing to pay for training, they're willing to pay for research, and they're willing to pay for communications products, but that use story. So we use fictional and real life stories in videos and explainer videos and podcasts. But very few are willing to look at narrative intelligence. We've done some work with another destination marketing organization to help them with their strategic stories. So how to take the organization's story and embed that for all levels of employees, so that everyone is aligned in a strategy. So from the CEO down to the front of line receptionist, they're able to say in one line, this is who we are and what we do, and extract the stories that speak to that. So narrative intelligence, or NI, speaks to to the entire sort of gambit of how well you use the skills of story, especially the skills of listening. And what we find in our work is that almost as a side effect, we see improved communications between different divisions and a lessening of hierarchy between managers and juniors through the use of story. The use of personal story in our values workshops, for instance, have become so powerful that it really helped to grow organizations. We've had senior leaders come out in our some of our values workshops, and then because of the extreme closeness of the container, what we do in our values workshop is we use personal stories in the mornings. We work only with the executive, but in the afternoons we bring in junior employees and we ask them to share stories of organizational practice. So if a value is kindness, we ask the employees to speak about when have they experienced kindness in the organization. And so by bringing juniors and C-suite together, we're able to lessen this hierarchy. And we often find that the information then starts flowing between the divisions. And this is what an example of narrative intelligence.
Great. I'm just going to unmute everyone for a minute. So if someone else has a question, because a few people have called in. So are there other questions out there right now for Stuart?
Hi, this is Tricia speaking, and I'm really enjoying the presentation. Lots of information here. Not so much a question as an observation. I'm just really struck by the difference between storytelling and story collecting. And I think I'm thinking back to some things I've done and been part of when I guess I thought I was story collecting, but I may have had that point of view that we talked about. We start off with a point of view and then we backfill. We look for the story to support the point of view. So that's something that just struck me. I'm going to be very aware of moving ahead. So thank you for that.
Steve, thank you. I like the fact that you shared something about the fact that it's important to go first. And I find that sometimes I think we do it intuitively. When people say, "What about you?" And I think it's an important thing to remember that that's the way to get introduced to somebody, to build a trust. The other thing I thought was interesting is you mentioned something about—
And Jules, can you try to talk right by your—
Okay, sorry.
Perhaps because you go in and out.
Okay, so I was mentioning the fact that you learning to go first, share a bit of the story to help people come towards you to start to sharing is important. The other thought I was good to hear was back when I was recruiting, I would do background checks or teach people how to check references or the story or the context of where the individual worked. And I always did see exactly what you were saying. It was listen to what not said in the references, like the space between the notes, the pauses, the breathing, in order to dig further and do a much more comprehensive interview. It's really interesting, the science and what you've experienced too. Thank you. I've enjoyed listening to most of your choice of terms and how you're capturing the art of what you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. Yeah, it's been something that's been learned in the field. And one of our most popular trainings is Story Collectors. It's a 2-day workshop. And we're finding that more and more people from consulting firms are looking to learn this, because as a consultant, you're always working with people. And if you can find ways to extract more information from them in a good way. So things like body language, building rapport, trust, the technology behind it. So these are the things that we've learned in the field, and it helps when you're working with, I think, quite a diverse demography. So if you're working with people that are semi-literate, in farmers, etc., you can't go in there with huge camera crews, or even pinning a mic, a lapel mic to them is going to make them nervous. And so we've had a great opportunity to learn that, and we teach a lot of story collecting to nonprofit organizations who need to collect stories of success stories to report back to funders. And so we end up teaching entire sort of communications departments on how to collect these stories. But most important behind that is also, it's not just the technique, but also teaching what makes for a story. So the story arc or the hero's journey. Because what we often find is people will say, well, we have a great story, and it's actually not a story. It's say Julian went to university, she studied hard, and she got a degree, and now she's living happily ever after. They're so intent on trying to tell positive stories that there's nothing in it. It's quite boring. We're looking for a hero's journey story, and we're looking for the transformation of the character, and therefore often we need to push back to our clients and say, well, actually, that's not really a great story. That's an anecdote. Let's find something where the person had to struggle a bit, where the organization had to struggle. And we're also particularly interested in collecting origin stories and founder stories of organizations. And so we find that companies or that are usually around 200 employees and larger are the sweet spot where the founders are still there and they're just about to get really large. And in order to inculcate the values to their employees, they need to collect the origin stories. And so then that's been quite successful as well.
Stuart, I would guess that forming your questions to elicit the stories is something that you've spent a fair amount of time on, just to guess. But any thoughts on how to create evocative questions?
I try to do that as little as possible, Tom, because we find that the simpler the questions, we're really just kind of facilitating this process. If someone's in front of us wanting to spend the hours with us, they already know what they want to tell, and we're simply guiding them along. We're guiding them along what we call transcribing. So we're actually trying to get the story out of them. Our job is to identify from all of this talk. And often, you have pressures. You have a certain time limit with them. You're on the road. You need to collect a series of stories. But our job to transcribe is to find that story thread of the hero's journey, and then to keep them on that. So often, what will happen is we'll start off with one particular story, what we thought was a story, and then 45 minutes later, we'll realize there's a different hero's journey story here. And once we identify that, then we ask them to fill in the details, to give us the texture and the color behind that. And then sometimes if we're recording, we'll also ask them to actually say that again, but in a clear way that we can record the voiceover. So actually it's about listening for the story triangle, the story arc. And once you have that, to kind of just keeping them on track. That's the biggest challenge that we have in our story collectors.
And when you think of that, just take us through what you mean by that particular story arc.
So for us, the story has to have the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. So there needs to be some call to action. So the hero of the story, which is usually the teller, they're going on with life as per usual, and something happens and they're called to action, they're called to go out. And some people refuse the call, in which case probably it'll come at some other point. And then so in the story I was relating earlier about the woman who works for the big fishing company, she worked as what in South Africa we call a tea lady, which is a term for basically someone who makes tea in the cafeteria. But as she looked out at the employees, she realized she could be much more. She could achieve more. So in order for her to achieve more, she needed to educate herself. I don't think she had a high school diploma. She certainly didn't have any computer learning. But she found an ally. So most people, when they go on their adventure, need allies. In her, one of the stock controllers, and who shared time with her, put her onto some computer courses. And as a woman in South Africa, she was up against certain things. People would say to her, you can't be more than you are already. This is all that you're going to be in life. Be happy with it. She had to deal with that as well as the internal voices. So this is now her dealing with the conflicts. She did work herself up. She now works as a stock controller, and she works on computers, but she already is looking to go up to the next level. She also managed to get a driver's license, and she's looking to purchase a car and be the first one in her family. I mean, this doesn't sound much to perhaps people sitting in North America, but for someone that comes from the rural area of the Eastern Cape with no education, for a black woman in South Africa, this is massive strides up. And her daughters she sees things for her daughters as well. And all of this is underpinned by a great faith that she has. So Buzelwa demonstrates that and this story, when we collected the story, was actually about the payout that she received from the company that allowed her to purchase a new house. But the company had no idea of how these benefits and the internal life of this family. So as a hero, Buzelwa has had to overcome certain challenges, and by doing so, she's transformed. And getting her to be able to see her transformation. And so she says in our video, I wanted a new house, and God gave it to me. I wanted a better job, and God gave it to me. And now I want a car, and God gave it to me. So we're getting her to actually reflect back on her journey over the last 5-10 years and to see how she's transformed. And that's really the goal of the story that we're trying to get to. And we don't need to pull out any kind of lessons or morals. Those will be self-evident for the listeners and the viewers. So that's what we're looking for. And once we find it, we will then start to push and for the details and texture. So she says, I want to buy a car. So say, what car do you want to buy? Toyota Yaris. Okay, well, why? So we start to probe. And she just says, and then we go off to a Toyota dealership. And this is the energy I spoke of before. She mentioned the car. And so we went off to the dealership and we said to the dealer principal, can we film her in this car? And he said, sure. And he actually drove her around and we put a camera in, which is almost unheard of. I mean, they didn't know us from anywhere. There were no issues around permission forms or legal stuff. And I think it's with this energy and being true to the story that people actually will somehow resonate off that and open doors for us.
Great. Well, we're moving towards the end of our call, but let me open it up again just to everyone. So I'm going to unmute us all. And if there's somebody who hasn't asked a question yet, now would be the time to do that. Anybody out there that's wondering something?
Tom, this is Tricia. Can you hear
Yes.
me? Okay.
Yes, we
I was
can.
just wondering, a question I have is simply, I'd like to learn more about the article that Stuart mentioned. He said he wrote an article. Is this on your website? You said it was the difference between story collecting and storytelling.
Yeah. Hi, Tricia. Yeah, it's on our website under Insights.
Terrific. Thank you.
Sure.
So, and everybody who's on this call, you would have gotten a link to Stuart's website, but Stuart, for people who are listening to this after the fact, just tell us what the website URL is.
So our website is www.rothcommunications. That's ROTH communications.co.za.
.co.za.
For South Africa. Just a point, Tom, that this piece between story collecting and storytelling is always a confusing one. It's one that we have to explain. And it certainly comes out of my background in social studies, and my passion remains research. And I don't have the answers yet of how to explain it so simply that people get it, because the word storytelling itself is very powerful. And we can't win by trying to combat or oppose storytelling. So hi there, got a nice young audience. So it's story collecting. People refer to it as story harvesting. Story extraction is a little bit harsh. Mm-hmm. Because there are ethical issues around. So if you're working for a large corporate and you're going to gather the stories of individuals, often who have very little power, economic power otherwise. One has to be careful of the language. So story collecting is kind of the neutral term that we've come up with. It's still not one that I'm 100% happy with, and other people refer to as story harvesting.
Yeah, and let's see, Jules has another comment or question.
Do you have any thing posted on your site about what you mentioned? You coach your executives first, maybe in a session. How do you coach them on how they're going to accept other people's stories and be comfortable? What's some of the ways you do that?
Jules, repeat the last part of the question again.
Okay, so what are some of the things you do to coach the executive? You're encouraging to share a personal story, but also it's very important to them to understand how to receive a story when somebody takes that leap of faith to share something important to them in a session. What are some of the things you do to get them ready for that sharing?
So thanks, Jules. So it's what we basically do is we build trust. We build trust between management and juniors. We build trust between divisions, and I seem to have some kind of gift where people will tell me their deepest secrets, including CEOs. And I hear this all the time. People say, "Don't tell anyone, but," and then they tell me something. So if I could monetize this somehow, I think I'd be a millionaire. In terms of, I try and keep it quite strategic. So, we're working with a CEO, we'll say, well, this is the new direction he wants to take the organization. And I don't know if, Tom, if there's time, I can give you an example of how we've done that.
Just briefly, I think just to honor our time commitment here, we need to finish in the next 5 minutes.
Okay, so I'll summarize that. But before I do that, Jules, I haven't actually worked with executives on how to receive stories. And I think you've identified a great need, because within organizations, people are always sharing stories, and how they're received is really important, because that speaks to the trust container that's built, right? And usually, if you have some kind of story, you would maybe go to HR, which HR is mostly working on legal issues. So perhaps you go to a company therapist, or some kind of, companies got hotlines for stories. But I think at this, you've identified a real missing piece, which is how we can become better not story collectors, but story listeners, perhaps. And that's something that it's gonna jog my memory on this one, from this conversation, as to how to train people to do that. We train people in receiving stories, but it's something else to train them as to what not to do with the stories. Part of our story collectors is a whole section on ethics, because that mostly speaks to where the stories could go, how they could be used. But I think you've identified something quite different, which is a part of narrative intelligence. So thank you for that. Yeah. I think, Tom, there's not going to be enough time for me to relate the story of the leadership storytelling. But very briefly, an organization was undergoing a new direction. And we helped the CEO identify a personal story where, as a young man, he had a bright new idea and he thought he could do it himself. Instead, he had to start working with some of the older members of his, in this case, it was actually a nuclear power factory. And only once he started consulting with the older members was he able to come up with a solution. And he told the story to the 200 plus members of his organization. And the idea was that, without you guys on board, we're not going to be able to move the organization in a certain direction. We need your input. And he told this, and he got a standing ovation from the members. And usually people, when they give speeches, they kind of give facts and figures and the whole PowerPoint thing. And he did this just through the use of personal story, which we helped him to extract, to build, to work along the hero's journey, to build a little bit of interesting details. And it was extremely well received. And so we know that it's proved the test case.
Yes. Stuart, any kind of final thing that you'd like to share with us today? Anything to leave us with?
I don't think so. I think what Jules has identified is something really exciting for me. And it's a place where we could expand into training people as to become better story listeners, not for the sake of research or for communications materials, but rather for helping people, just to connect with people and helping people feel more at home within the organization. I think there's a great need for that. So I'm certainly going to look at how to train those skills.
Right.
Great. And if there's any burning comment or question, we'll just, I've unmuted everybody again. So if there's anything there that you'd like to say, now's the last chance. Great. Well, Stuart, thank you so much for taking your time to share with us today.
Yay.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Interesting stuff. Yeah. If our board members can stay on the call for just a little bit, but everyone else, thank you very much for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.